Okay, I'm stepping away from the screen, so if somebody online has a question, please just shout out. It's okay, no problem, so that we can hear you. And if there's a question in the room here, we'll make sure to try and repeat that. Everybody okay so far? All right, let's go for it. All right, so you're all aware things are changing, things are expanding. So here's the deal. As of August 17th, remember this is August 17th we're talking about, you have to have a buyer brokerage agreement signed prior to ever showing a property. So before you ever show a property, you have to have an agreement signed. This means that our buyer consultations are going to have to be pushed forward. We're going to have to set appointments with our buyers to consult with them. Are there ways around some of this? Well, there are options or opportunities. How can we make this happen? Can a buyer brokerage agreement be at a certain percentage? What percentage do we put in a buyer brokerage agreement? Those are all the kinds of things we want to talk about openly here and figure out where and how and when. What agreement currently exists is the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement that Florida Realtors has created. That's the one that currently exists. And that's the one we can use. We can use it now. You may have used the NEFAR buyer brokerage agreement. When the forms sunset on Sunday evening, that went away. Everybody's aware that the forms were sunset for NEFAR, correct?
So we have some to dispose of those.
No. They're still valid. They're still valid. If you have a signed buyer brokerage agreement, it's still a valid agreement. It doesn't negate the agreement. It's just no longer available to use. So that's a really good point, is we don't have that available to use anymore. What is available for us to use is the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement by Florida Realtors. It's very similar to the NEFAR one, but I wanted to make sure that we went over it and that we started to look at places that probably will change as of July 9th. So wait a minute, you just said August 17th, why July 9th? Okay, well, they're releasing the revised buyer brokerage agreement on July 9th. This is available till July 9th. What's the difference between July 9 and August 17th? July 9 is when this will come out so that I can start to get acclimated to it. And August 17, I have to use it. So we're trying to encourage you to use it now. You've probably seen that in the checklists in app files, the buyer brokerage agreement has been there since November of last year as a request. Some of you are submitting it, some of you are not. It's okay, we haven't gone after you for it yet, but know that as of August 17th, you will have to have a buyer brokerage agreement. So we'll be coming after you for it. 100 years ago, well, actually, the 3 in here and a few online probably remember 100 years ago when you had to have someone sign an agency agreement.
Right.
You had to disclose to them what your representation was, and finally, Florida Realtor says you guys are stupid, you can't do this. You obviously don't understand because you're getting them signed after contracts, after closing, just before contract. So we're going to make an assumption for you. We're going to put everybody as a transaction broker in the state. So that was one of the things they did. So now we're coming to a similar type of situation. We have a buyer agency agreement. We have to have that agreement, and we're using that transaction brokerage buyer agency agreement. So these agreements have to be signed before you ever show a property. Everyone clear on that? What kind of, perfectly. What kind of questions do you have about that? Anything?
Where and how we get these forms and.
Okay. All right, so the forms that are coming on July 9th will be in app files just like all of our other forms. The forms are currently in app files. If you look at your sale and purchase agreement packs that are already set up in app files, they already contain the buyer brokerage agreement. They're already there. So if you go into app files and you create a new app file, and you choose a package and then select all and move all of those forms into your folder, that buyer agency agreement will be there.
But we should have had that signed before, right?
If you're working with a buyer?
Yeah.
If you're working with a buyer, before you ever showed them a property, you will now have to have this signed as of August 17th. So what might be a good process now is to start figuring out when is the best time for you to present this. So talk to me about opportunities to present this. When?
When you first begin.
When you first begin. Bonnie said when you first begin, absolutely. Bonnie over here says
Over
what?
2 or 3 drinks.
Over 2 or 3 drinks. Over
Buyer
5.
consultation.
So what was that, Jessica?
Buyer consultation.
Buyer consultation.
Yeah.
So there are lots of opportunities. What was the one you said? First time you meet with them. Okay, so what's the objection you think that we're gonna be having, or what's some of the objections you think we're gonna be having to the agreement when you start to sit down and talk to them about it?
I'm not paying you a dime.
Not gonna wanna pay what, Bonnie?
Don't want to pay you. Why should I pay you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why should I pay you? I've never had to pay you before. Why should I pay you? Right? So why do I have to pay you? What are some other things that we think are gonna pop up as we start to present this?
Do
When
I
you
have
gonna-
to,
When do I have to pay?
When do I have to pay, Jessica?
At closing.
We know that. We never-
Right, so the discussion, yeah, was that Beverly? Who was
What
that?
are you
Yes.
gonna do for the money?
What, Bonnie?
What are you gonna do for the money?
Yeah, what are you gonna do? Jessica, you sounded like you had something.
I was gonna say, why do I have to go into an agreement for 6 months or longer? If that's the terms. The terms, what are the terms?
What are the terms, okay?
Can the terms just be for one showing?
Okay. Kathy just said, can the terms be for one showing? Yes. There's a showing agreement that you can use for one showing.
Then you don't have to fill out all this?
And well, correct, you don't have to fill out a buyer brokerage agreement if it's for one showing, but what are you doing to protect yourself? If it's a buyer and you're gonna have multiple showings, you can have multiple showing agreements. This would cover you for any property.
I understand, but if there's resistance for this, but yet they still want to see a house, I didn't know we had a showing agreement.
Okay, so Kathy's point, this is one of the things that's come up in a lot of discussions is, how can I ask someone to commit to me when they don't have an idea of what I'm gonna do? They don't have an idea of what my value is. I haven't had a chance to meet with them, or I'm just starting to get to know them. I don't even know if I wanna work with them, let alone do they wanna work with me? So there are things that can be done. So for that, you can put a buyer agency agreement together. You can have it for one property, so you could do it for a property and then amend the buyer agency agreement. You could do a showing agreement that has a compensation for one property, or you could create a buyer agreement for a limited time because there's a term and have it be for 0 for a limited term, for a very short term. Bonnie? Online, Bonnie, did you have something?
No, I didn't say, no.
Okay,
A lot of times they don't know if they want to buy, they're just getting started, so we still have to make sure we are compensated in some fashion before we even
Right.
explore it, right?
well, it's not, the way this all came about, it's not that we have to make sure that we're compensated, that's part of it, that's our drive, is to make sure that if we spend a lot of time and energy working with someone, that there's the compensation for the work that we do at the end of the game. But more so for the buyer, it's the transparency that's supposed to be occurring. Is it the transparency for the buyer which says, hi buyer, this is who I am, this is what I do. If I do these things, don't I deserve to get paid? Yes, you deserve to get paid, great, this is what my fee is to get paid to do all of these things. So because again, it's the decoupling of the commission. In other words, it's not a total commission compensation. It's the seller negotiating for theirs and the buyer negotiating for what they pay is really the impetus of how this agreement came together and why we have to follow some of these new guidelines, or the impetus to follow some of these new guidelines is transparency.
Who came up with these forms?
Well, these forms were designed by Florida Realtors.
Did you help?
I did not. above my pay grade.
Has any of them ever worked in real estate?
Yes, okay, so, but just so we know, these have been around for about 10 years. These have been, the buyer agency agreements have been around for about 10 years, but a lot of us haven't used them because we meet someone, we sit with them, we develop a relationship, we develop a rapport. Many of our customers are coming from referrals, so we feel very comfortable and confident that the buyer is going to continue to work with us.
Right.
We know, I mean, how many years, up until 2.5 years ago, we used to say, or some of us used to say, I'm free to you because the seller pays for me. Well, when you look at it, the seller's not paying for you. Your fee or the fee to the buyer brokerage will still be rolled into something because it was a negotiation. The bottom line. So now this is breaking it out where the buyer gets to negotiate what they pay and the seller gets to negotiate what they pay. And if the seller chooses, and in most places where this has already gone into effect, we've already seen that sellers are still understanding the process and understanding that compensation to the buyer brokerage incentivizes the buyer to come to that property. But there are a lot of things that we're gonna have to figure out. So, and I think I've shared with some of you, there's a current case at the Florida Real Estate Commission where a listing brokerage has filed against a selling brokerage because the buyer's associate made an appointment to show a property, canceled the showing, and then gave feedback that said something to the effect, and this is not exact, but something to the effect of, you know, the buyer has elected not to see this property because the seller is not offering compensation. If the seller changes their mind, please let us know and we'll set another appointment. So the listing brokerage has now said, well, then the buyer's agent, the agent working with the buyer, the realtor working with the buyer, is now steering the buyer away from that property because that agent should already have a buyer agreement that guarantees they'll get paid. It shouldn't matter whether the seller pays or the buyer pays. The buyer's already agreed to pay. So there's no reason not to show the property. So you can see what kinds of things are gonna come up. People are gonna get upset about something, right?
Are you gonna have, I'm sorry.
Let's see, I heard one person, then I heard Bonnie. So if the person that spoke before Bonnie could speak, please.
It's me, Leslie. I was just gonna say my two things to add to your list were working with sellers who in the past have said, I've bought properties before and the seller pays. So definitely that one. But then the next one is, I'm a first-time home buyer. I don't have a lot of extra money. How am I gonna pay this?
Okay. All right, and then Bonnie?
Same thing. That was where I was going to, Leslie. Yeah. There's gonna be some that are gonna say, I can't pay you. I never had to pay you before. I can't pay you. Yeah.
Right, okay, so great points. Let's jump into the agreement so that we can see what's outlined in the agreement, so how we can deal with some of these. I'm sorry? Okay, so that we can understand a little bit about how some of these opportunities are gonna be covered in the agreement. So the first part of if you don't have the exclusive buyer agency agreement pulled up, the first part of it talks about the parties. Well, the parties are the buyer themselves and the brokerage. Pretty straightforward, pretty clean and easy. The buyer themselves and the brokerage. Of course, you put the Legends of Real Estate, Hazel Cooksey, Kathy Gibbs, you know, you can put your name after the brokerage, but it's the brokerage that's being compensated. So this is the exclusive right to work with and assist the buyer in locating and negotiating the acquisition of suitable real property as described below. The term acquire or acquisition includes any purchase, option, exchange, lease, or other acquisition of an ownership or equity interest in real property. So the good thing is that we're covered no matter what the buyer decides to do. If the buyer is looking to purchase and then changes their mind and decides to rent, if we help them find something to lease or rent, we still get compensated. The term of the agreement, so this goes back to what Jessica was saying, well, what are the terms? How do we define the terms? So the term of this agreement will begin on a certain day. So just like any listing agreement, this begins on a certain day and ends on a certain day. So it begins on a certain day of, month, and year, and will terminate at 11:59 on a certain day, month, and year, which is now the termination date. So how long do we think these should be in effect?
Well, we'd like to have it for a year or more, but if your buyer's in town for 3 weeks, they may say, I don't know what next year brings, and you know, I just wanna do it for a period I'm here.
So what would your recommendations be on the minimum term that you would think would be acceptable?
Depending on the circumstances, because if they're in from out of town, how long are they in from out of town? If it's somebody who you get the sense knows what they want, they have their head on straight, I'd say 45 to 60 days. And then Chris can review it. If we're looking at properties and nothing's coming together, at that point you've developed a relationship with them, can you extend it?
Yes.
I would rather
So-
not have the conversation every 30 days, so if you can extend it
Yeah, and then to remember to,
to do it,
yeah,
yeah.
So discussion in-house is that you probably want it for a longer period of time, however, based on their needs, you may have to be able to do it for a shorter period of time if they understand a little bit about what they want. But the question came up, can you extend this or can you amend the buyer agency agreement? Yes, you can amend the buyer agency agreement. Anybody online want to throw anything out? About
I
time?
think minimum is 6 months. I'd like 5 years, but a year would be okay.
Yeah, you can do what to do. And whether it's somebody out of town, here's the other piece that I think that we're all gonna have to acknowledge is fair housing and consistency. So, or the other pieces, fair housing and consistency. Here's our challenge. The brokerage will set what we believe there should be a minimum, and I would think that would be 4 to 6 months. 4 to 6 months would be a minimum term that we would find acceptable and that you should be using. Have I come up with it yet? No, I haven't. But here's the reasoning. If we set a standard for the brokerage at 4 months, let's say,
Mm.
and you're asking someone for a year or you're asking someone for 2 weeks, we need to make sure that it's consistent in why we're making those changes. Those changes have to be consistent and clear. So I'm making the change from 4 months to 2 weeks because you're an out-of-town buyer, you will only be here for 2 weeks. Well, what if they come back? Don't you want to be the agent they use when they come back? So, we have to be very careful of making changes or being random in the timeline that we set for the contract term. Yes.
well, I think that if you can say, this is our company policy, X number of months.
Right.
Because technically, they can fire us too.
Absolutely. So to Bonnie's point, we can fire.
I wouldn't say, look, if you're not working, you can fire me. If I could say, the company policy is, and that takes it off of me.
Right.
It's established, it's across the board.
Right.
Now, if they want to ask somebody else, what their company policy is, I think we can do that by them.
But, and to Bonnie's point, if we start with something consistent, like our company policy is 4 months, company policy is 6 months, remember, if you've started that way and the buyer chooses to negotiate with you and you choose to accept those terms, or we as a brokerage through you accept those terms, then it was the buyer who was negotiating the terms, which is the place we really want to be. So we'll be looking for a standard on the term. I realize you guys all have reasons why you make it a shorter term or why you make it a longer term, but we'll have a standard that we use, and then that would be something that would be negotiated with the buyer based on their needs or based on your determination. Go ahead.
Bonnie mentioned that they can fire you. Is there a form for termination of this agreement?
So there is termination in this agreement, it has to be done in writing.
That's why I asked, is there a form for that?
There is not a form, it can be done via email. Now, as of the 9th, there might be a modification to this agreement form, which would indicate a release of liability on all parties. But as of this time, there is no current form to modify this agreement. So any modification would have to be in writing, and in writing would be via email.
Well, if they're bouncing around to another agent, they have to terminate with us before they can.
So, and that's the other good thing about this buyer agency agreement is it does connect that individual to you. So if that individual now goes and signs another agreement with someone else, this takes precedence. Of course, if they signed one before you, that one takes precedence.
Like if they go builders, rep and talks to one of the home site agents there, and they're connected with us, and they don't know, they have to sign another agreement. I don't know how that's gonna work.
Well, they wouldn't be, remember, the site salesperson doesn't work for the buyer. The buyer is still on their own unless they have an agency agreement.
They pick them up though all the time.
Yeah. if
Well, they
we
pick
had-
them up, but remember, if you have a buyer agency,
They're tied to us.
they're tied to you.
That's a good thing.
So for sure, in that instance, they would be responsible for paying you and not the builder, is that what this conversation is?
Well, that's the way that's how we would use this agreement. That's why this agreement is strong, is that in cases where the buyer goes to like a,
Open house or.
well, open houses are completely different. So if a buyer goes to new construction, you know, that question, are you working with the realtors, down the back of the registration form in very small print, they're gonna have to make that larger print. But your buyer also has to know that they've already, this is the other thing, when they sign this, they know they're committed to you. Before, you didn't have them signing anything, so this is a good thing when it comes to things like new construction. It can be a good thing in open houses. To open houses, the rules are that if I'm a buyer going into an open house, you, the agent, do not have to have me sign anything. I'm allowed to walk through the house, do whatever. You can ask me, am I working with a realtor? If I say no, you could be in the process of trying to connect with me. But at that point, if you're connecting with me, your best bet is to set a buyer consult and get a buyer agency agreement signed so that there's a link for the two of you. So justifying the value and then having the buyer agency agreement signed.
So I do that, as they're filling this out, they go, oh, I filled one up in Berkshire 2 weeks ago. Wow.
Okay, well, if you're in an open house, if they say they filled out one, then you need to say to them, great, you need to go back to your realtor.
Right.
And if it's a buyer consult, and they go, oh, yeah, I filled one of these out 2 weeks ago when I talked to a Berkshire. So,
Great, so time out, let me ask you a couple of questions. Did you complete a buyer agency agreement? Yes, it did. How long is that term? 1 week. Okay, great, then you're fine. Create a new agreement after that. 6 months. Okay, well, then I'm sorry, I can't help you, you have to go back to your agent.
Unless you wanna terminate with her. This
I
can't-
would stay away from
I
saying,
know,
I would
I
stay
see.
away from, no, I mean, if you could slip that in, that's great. But, you know, I don't want you guys to get, I don't wanna have complaints, you know, or ethics violations, you know, like, oh, I told them to fire.
Clark taught me to say,
I'm gonna digress here a minute because back up to that lease or other acquisition. So that means a for sale by owner, if you're driving around and you call it for sale by owner, you still owe me a commission, is
That's
that what
right.
that says?
That's exactly what this says.
Oh, so many times I
so
wished I had
may-
this form.
Okay. So maybe now the light bulb is coming on, why this form might actually be a value to what you do, establish that. Just like you would never take a listing without a listing agreement, we shouldn't be dragging buyers around or consulting the buyers without some sort of understanding of how we're gonna get compensated. And I realize that's, say what?
loyalty.
Loyalty, right?
They'll probably say, I'll call them like I'll leave you,
I'll call them
if they don't wanna, you know.
if they wanna fire the other person.
Well, if they can go into, well, if you've got to sign an agreement, we still get paid, they need to know what their
Right.
options are on that.
Right, so when they sign the buyer agency agreement, that's connecting them to us, to you.
Mm.
So if they do, so in Bonnie's situation where she's talking to someone, when they first got into the open house, they said, you know, no, I'm not working with a realtor. Bonnie started talking to them, started to talk to them about other properties, and said, well, if we're gonna move forward, I think it's time for us to maybe execute a buyer agency agreement. Maybe it was at the open house because it wasn't as busy as other open houses, or maybe you went from there to coffee for a buyer consult, and they go, oh, this form looks familiar, I think I signed one of these with Brokerage Z the other day. Oh, okay, well, let me understand, because remember, they probably don't remember what the form looked like. So it could have been an exclusive buyer agency agreement, right, with a term, but we don't know what the term was. So if the term's expired, you're up. If it was just a showing agreement, and the showing agreement was for a specific property or specific properties, then that agent is their agent for those properties, but you can be their agent for other properties. Can you put an exclusion on this? Yes, you can put exclusions on this, so if there were properties on page 3, you could exclude certain properties from this agreement. In other words, you could exclude certain properties from being compensated on if the buyer chooses that property.
Suppose someone does not want to commit, they say, I'd love to look at properties with you, I'm not ready to commit to anything, you know, they can show me this fine. Go into another agent.
Well, another agent's gonna have to do the same thing. So if you didn't hear it, Hazel saying, what if you have a consult, you sit and talk with the buyer, and the buyer says, look, I don't wanna execute an agreement, I don't wanna work with you. Right, so now we have to figure out what makes sense. This is why the showing agreement could potentially make sense to agree to compensate you for one showing. You could create a buyer agency agreement that's executed by all parties, but the compensation is 0. Then you know that your compensation will be nothing unless this gets amended. So if the buyer signs this and any property you show them at that point, we would get paid nothing except for the company dollar.
You
And
do that, if you want to spend
If
time.
you wanna pay the company dollar and spend time with them and drive them around and not get compensated.
But would you just assume at that point that the property you're showing them, that seller is going to pay?
Well, okay, so now we can get further into compensation, but that's coming up. But the way the agreements are written is that we will do what we can to get compensation from the seller to offset, and this is me talking in English, not in the legal language here, that we will seek compensation first from the other party, but if we don't get anything, they're still responsible. So I think Jill said the other day, you know, I've gotta go, when we do this, we've got to be strong in this, you're paying me this. Are there the opportunity to offset what you have agreed to pay me? Yes. The seller could compensate, we can negotiate, yes, absolutely. But you're paying me something for the work that I'm gonna do. Right? So could that end up being that they pay you nothing? It could be if you've agreed with the seller, if you've agreed with the buyer to be paid, and I'm sorry, let me just back up 2 seconds. This conversation is with agents from Legends of Real Estate. Anything that we discuss is related to the Legends of Real Estate. If you're viewing this and you are not with the Legends of Real Estate, this does not apply to you.
We're really
So-
just steering them to the listing agent, they will find a way around it, if they're just in here looking at a couple of properties, not sure if they wanna move here, they're just not ready to commit to paying commissions if.
But the listing agent may not have an agreement with the seller to pay you. The seller is agreeing to pay nothing, the listing agent,
She may
They're
go
not.
for nothing, you know?
maybe so, I don't know, I doubt it.
Doesn't the listing agent?
Can you speak up so they can?
Yeah, so if it's a listing agent working with a buyer, doesn't that listing agent still have to do the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement?
Absolutely.
So even if they go back to the listing agent, they still have to do this unless they're gonna settle for getting nothing but what the seller's already agreed
Right.
to pay the listing agent for one side. Now that listing agent's gonna do both sides for the same money.
Well, I don't know, we don't know what I see, and I don't think we will, we haven't seen it in other markets.
I don't think so.
People are not moving to the listing agent because either people want consumers want representation. They're finding that it's not working to try and go to the listing agent because they find that they have the same thing occurs. They still have to have the same conversation with the listing agent as how long are we connected to each other and what's gonna be compensated. That's why each party has to work on its own.
Correct. I think one of the things that's missing in this is theoretically, the seller has always paid the buyer's agent. However, that was always rolling into the price. So if you educate your buyer how things are now are really not any different than they've always been. It's just a different direction. I think you're gonna have a better shot at having this signed because you've now said to the buyer, look, this is how it's always been. And
The price does not reflect.
right, exactly. It was just the way, you know, what envelope the money came out of, but it still is going to be close to what it always was, just so it's just gonna be titled differently.
I would really veer away from any conversation like that. You have to have a conversation. The whole push is that the conversations have to occur individually.
Yes.
So saying to a buyer, it's really no different. The money is still coming from the same place, or the money can still come from the same place, is not separating who pays who pays who.
Okay.
Who pays. So I shouldn't use the word steer. We have to have individualized conversations. That's why we want to be talking about this, is because we have to start to find our words for how we communicate and our value for how we communicate with a buyer. The agreement exists. The agreement will change in July, well, now, in the next week or so, and it'll look a little differently. Will the same components be there? Some will be, some will not. But we have to figure out how to have those conversations with the buyers about the seller may or may not offer compensation. We have to look at that separately. What we have to look at is, what's our relationship? What do I bring to the table? And for that, should I not get compensated?
Right.
And if the answer is, I don't want to compensate you, you can create, because we've all learned that 0 is a number, right? Compensation has gone all the way down to 0 in MLS. So we know that 0 is a number. Can this be created at 0? Yes, it can be created at 0. Can this be amended after you feel like you've created a stronger relationship? Yes, it can be amended after you've created a stronger relationship. How does this impact the buyer's selection on properties? Well, a buyer can choose to see whatever properties they would like, and that's been part of the decoupling of the commission and the transparency. The belief has been, and in some cases accurate, that the realtor chooses the properties to show the buyer based on the compensation that's being advertised. Have we all looked at the compensation before? Probably. Have we been disgusted at times about the compensation that's being offered? Most likely. Have we refused to show a property? Probably not, but there are others that have. So the goal was to create not only that transparency, but to avoid that and push the decision back to the buyer to say, I want to see these properties. And for the buyer to say to you, I need you to tell me what the compensation is that's being offered on these properties so that I know what differential I'm going to be paying.
They're not always selecting the properties that most of the time we're looking into an area, trying to help them with what's available. So we go with them.
But,
Right.
but if it's not on MLS, how are we supposed to know?
So you have to call.
I'll call all the agents to see if you're a seller.
So you're correct. You're the source of the information. You're the source of the available properties. But they tell you, of the 7 you want to see, you showed me, or you sent me, I want to see 4 of them, right? Or I want to see all 7 of them. Or I want to see those 7 plus 17 more. Whatever it happens to be, they decide that they want to go see properties. So at some point in this process, we're going to have that discussion with the buyer about, how do you want, once you've sent me those properties that you want to see, are you comfortable seeing all of them? Will compensation impact your ability to, or your desire to choose a property to see? And the only way that we're going to know the compensation is we're going to have to call. Now, you all know how hard it is to get some realtors on the phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you may have to call, you may have to email. This is the reason for the compensation agreements. The compensation agreements would allow an agent, a listing, to provide to the seller. This is why those compensation agreements are in both the buyer's packages and the seller's packages. because then you as an agent could send a buyer's agency agreement, or excuse me, compensation agreement over, asking them to complete that and return it, or you can add it to your offer and request compensation that the buyer can request. The buyer has to be the one requesting, request compensation from the seller to the buyer's brokerage. So that's what those two new compensation agreements can facilitate, is understanding what the seller is willing to do, and if the seller will pay the listing brokerage and the listing brokerage will pay the buyer's brokerage, or if the seller will pay the buyer's brokerage directly. That's those two agreements that just came out.
Clark,
Yeah. Go ahead, Bonnie.
okay, don't you think buyers are gonna get to the point where they're gonna say, okay, they're gonna see a house and they're gonna go, well, is the seller gonna pay your fee here? Is that not what's gonna happen up the road? And are we going to be able to say yes or no?
So, absolutely, so if a buyer says to you, I want to see what the compensation is that the seller is offering, if any.
Yeah.
Before we see the house, then you have an obligation to show them that, so that they know what the differential is. If they say, I really don't care, we'll figure it out after we see, and you go see a house and they narrow it down to 3 and they say, okay, what's the compensation on that's being offered on these 3? And you say, 2%, 2.5%, 2%.
Okay,
And you have a buyer agency agreement at 2.5, then the buyer knows that they have a 0.5% differential that they're gonna be responsible for on 2 of the 3 properties. So if they say, okay, I like one of these ones at 2%, let's make the offer, and they choose to say to you, when you write the offer, I want you to request 2.5% from the seller, you can do that. That's the buyer asking the seller to compensate more than has already been disclosed, and you have every right to do that. The buyer has every right to do that as part of their offer.
under normal circumstances, would we put that into the contract anyway, when we already know that he is going to pay X number of bananas?
You mean if you've called the listing agent, the listing agent said we're paying 2.5%, would you put that into the offer?
Right. If that's what, yeah, if that's what the agreement is with the buyer too, would you?
Yes.
Okay,
However, you would put it under the seller closing costs, under other,
okay,
and you would also need to attach one of the compensation agreements, because you would need to know whether the seller is paying the buyer brokerage or the monies are flowing through the listing brokerage.
but we have to get that from the listing agent, right?
Correct. So
And if we don't have that,
if you don't have the amount,
oh no, if we don't have that form, we just have gotten a verbal from them, then what are we doing?
I'm sorry, who did you get the verbal from?
From the listing agent, but she texted to me, let's hypothetically, she texts me, oh, they're gonna pay you X amount, okay? Okay,
Okay.
but I don't have the form to attach, I can do it later, am I correct?
Yeah, you can then attach the form, the compensation agreement form, to the offer, because the monies flow from the seller. It's whether the monies flow from the seller to the listing brokerage, to the buyer's brokerage, or from the seller to the buyer's brokerage. That's what the two agreements are for.
Okay, that's fine.
So if I'm the listing agent and I tell you the seller's willing to pay 2.5% on this, and you say, great, can you send me over a compensation agreement showing that? And they say, yes, 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 and now your buyer's ready to write the offer, and you still haven't received it, then you can put into the seller closing costs, seller to pay 2.5% towards buyer's brokerage, but then you would have to include one of the 2 compensation agreements. And since you don't know, because you haven't talked to the listing agent, if the monies flow through the brokerages or straight from the seller, I would probably use the seller to buyer brokerage, because that would commit the seller to paying our buyer's brokerage without connection back to the listing brokerage.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm getting blank stares, which is here, so I'm thinking we may have some online too.
No, I understand.
Sure, Bonnie Brady said, can I say that again? So, and I'm gonna try. Anyway. If I'm the listing broker and if I'm the listing agent and you call me and say, is the seller willing to cooperate with buyer brokerage? And I say, yes, the seller has established that they will pay a buyer brokerage 2.5%. And then you say to me, great, can you send me a compensation agreement? And I say, yes, I'll send you a compensation agreement. Now I go off in 17 different angles, I get distracted by a shiny object, and I don't send it to you, but your buyer's ready to send their offer in, right?
Right.
So then you would write into seller compensation, or excuse me, seller closing costs, you would write there, seller to pay 2.5% towards buyer's brokerage, and then you would attach the seller to buyer's brokerage compensation agreement, indicating 2.5%.
Well,
Because
if there's been an agreement for 2, and we're asking the buyer saying, see if they'll pay the 2.5 like the other house has, they may have to call the sellers to get an agreement and then get back to you. It could take a little time.
no, you don't have, that's not, the sellers, Hazel was saying, well, if the seller has an agreement with the listing brokerage
Yeah,
for 2% and you're
want
asking for 2.5, then the listing brokerage has to go back and negotiate with the seller. No, that's part of what this is. No, it's the buyer has to ask the seller to pay whatever they want to their buyer's brokerage. If the seller says, okay, great, I advertised 2%, but because you have such a strong offer, I'll pay 2.5% to your buyer brokerage, then there's no problem. If you have a buyer's brokerage agreement that says 2.5%, and the seller says, no, based on the terms and conditions you're offering, I will continue to pay the 2% that I agreed, then the buyer is responsible for the extra 0.5%.
Right.
Excuse me, that's why buyers are gonna wanna know what the seller's willing, what the seller's willing to pay, so that they know what they're gonna be responsible for.
Yeah. Okay.
But the buyer compensation, excuse me, the compensation agreements memorialize those facts. Okay, so that's why you wanna use those. Alright, so we know we got a term, we got up to the term, we'll set a standard for the brokerage. I agree with Bonnie. What you want to say? Brady. I agree with Bonnie. Brady, go ahead and use us as your standard. Excuse me, use us as your fallback to say this is the term that our brokerage requests, and then negotiate with the buyer, which is exactly what this is set up to do. Property, the buyer is interested in acquiring real property as follows, or is otherwise acceptable to the buyer. What type of property? So single family homes, condos, can you list more than one type? Yes, list more than one type. Location, we've had this discussion before on location. Please don't use the state of Florida. If you want to use Northeast Florida, great. If you want to use Clay County, that's fine, but remember, if they then something in any other contiguous county, you could be discounted.
well, in my case, where there's Palm Beach, Neptune, Atlantic Beach, I mean, there must be
That's why.
a half a dozen places within 10 miles.
Right, so then why would you use Northeast Florida? Or why wouldn't you use the Jacksonville metro area? Or list the zip codes?
Okay.
Or anything else out? List the county. It's just that what we've learned from the legal side is if you say the state of Florida, what then comes into play is, well, can you truly serve that customer well throughout the state of Florida? Would you have good information to be able to advise them well in Naples or in Miami or in the Panhandle? And the court systems, when you try to enforce this, would probably say no. So use what you know and build up our referral list.
I have a question.
Yeah,
So in that case, you say Northeast Florida, but then your customer decides, oh, I might want to start looking in Central Florida. I might want to live in the villages.
Right.
So then of course I cannot represent them there because I know they're exclusive. So they have to sign another agreement with another agent, correct?
They would,
But
because
they're
then,
both still valid.
yes, they are
Okay.
both valid because the areas are different.
Okay.
Just like if the timelines were different, start and end, then they would both be valid.
Right.
Unless there would be a
But
termination.
there's no need for us to call ahead, because there's no referral in it.
Oh, absolutely. Sure, of course. So if they decide, in Gina's example, if someone decides now to look at Center Florida Villages, then my response would be, great, let us find someone to help you down there.
Mhm.
So let me find you someone to work with them.
Right.
And then you could use your network. Or if they say, oh, well, my mom lives down there and she's already got someone she's working with, then you're probably out. Or you can you could still potentially request a referral.
Mhm.
If they buy that. Can you write into here? I'd be very careful about it, but could you write into additional terms or special clauses? Interest in areas outside of this will be managed through a referral. Could you write something like that? Sure. Will the buyer sign it? I don't know. I don't know where they know other realtors. I don't know who would refer them to other places, so. All right, price range. Be careful of the price range. I mean, 0 to 13 million or whatever. There-
Can I
Say what?
ask a question before you go on to price range, please?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is regarding a listing agent having a property and you have a buyer without an agency agreement. They could technically go directly to the listing agent. Is that right? How will they, is there a way that they have access to MLS on their own, or like Zillow or all the others tell who the listing agent is? So what's to preclude them from going directly to the listing agent? And would the listing agent consider that a listing and a sale if they were able to get the buyer? I don't know if that makes sense, but if they had the buyer, would they have to go back to their, if they had a 0% co-op fee, would they be able to get money from their seller to pay for a buyer on their own?
Okay, so you've got a couple of things there. So if a buyer has executed a buyer agency agreement with you, and they want to go to the list, they feel like they can get a better deal by going to the listing agent, they would have to terminate they would have to terminate the buyer agreement with you before going to the listing agent. Once they got to the listing agent would still be required to have the buyer execute a buyer agency agreement.
Or a showing.
Or a
one-time
showing. Correct.
It could be for a lot less. The listing side.
So we don't know. I mean, I don't know if they're, depending on what the standards are for their brokerage or
Yeah.
what the listing agent decides to do, then, I mean, they could. Yeah, they could put it.
I mean, would they technically have to take that out of their listing commission to have the buyer, or just not get a commission for a buyer?
So if the listing agent is negotiated compensation for listing with the seller, that compensation stays intact. If the listing agent then wants to negotiate with a buyer for their compensation through a buyer agency agreement, it would be whatever compensation that listing agent, which is now a buyer's agent for the buyer, and the buyer agreed to his compensation. If the seller was offering nothing, then the listing agent would be negotiating with the buyer for compensation on the buy side. Could the listing agent negotiate with the buyer to take 0 and only take the listing commission? Yes. Yeah. If the seller, I mean, we don't know if the seller was offering buyer compensation, unless when you went and asked about it, they said, yes, the seller is offering 1% buyer brokerage compensation. So we wouldn't know.
Okay.
So can a buyer try and up what's that, around? And
Steer around.
go around,
And run.
end run, thank you. Can they end run around you?
Yeah.
Yes, would have to terminate your agreement first.
Okay.
Would they still have to have an agreement as a buyer with the agent that has the listing? Yes, they'd still have to have a buyer's agency agreement with the agent that has the listing, so it doesn't preclude them from signing an agreement unless they went and did non-rep for the buyer and just continued to work with the seller.
So if someone wants to terminate their agreement and you know they're looking elsewhere,
Well, there is a protection period.
okay.
So, but if they would, for us to not go after them through the protection period, they would have to terminate and not sign another agency agreement. If they terminate and then sign another buyer brokerage agreement, then just like a listing, when they sign with someone else, we're out.
So Clark, this is
Yeah.
Leslie. So if you're taking a listing and
Right.
you negotiate for the compensation to list the home, at that time, are you getting a compensation agreement from the seller to pay a buyer's broker?
You can, so the new listing agreements, we're not sure whether they're coming out on the 9th or the 23rd, I'm thinking probably the 23rd of July. But the way that it will be broken out is you will have, and this is in my head, I don't know how they're doing it, that there would be paragraph 4, listing brokerage compensation. And there would be a discussion between you and the seller as to what you bring to the table and what the compensation will be to you and your brokerage. Then paragraph 5 would say cooperative compensation. And then you would have to have that discussion. Is there an interest in offering an incentive to the buyer to offset any compensation that the buyer may have negotiated with the buyer's brokerage in order to come and see your home? Yes, no, maybe so. So that goes back to your first time home buyer that you were asking about, which is VA does allow now, as of August something, last August, allows the buyer to, well, they sent it out this in June 12th, I think it was, that the buyer can now pay brokerage compensation, but do they have the money becomes the case. And if they don't have the money, so if they've agreed to pay you, if the buyer's brokerage, sorry, I'm going over the buyer brokerage. So on the listing agreement, to answer your question, yes, there will be a space to negotiate for listing brokerage compensation or seller's brokerage compensation, and buyer's brokerage compensation will be a separate negotiation.
So that in a sense, if you are the listing agent and you're going to work with the buyer, that would secure your compensation.
It would secure your compensation. In Kim's example, she said the seller was offering 0.
Oh, okay.
But you're correct, if you're the listing brokerage, if you're the seller's brokerage, and you negotiate at the time of listing for the listing brokerage and the cooperating compensation, then yes, you've secured what would be normally paid to the listing brokerage and to the buyer's brokerage. But the listing agent to work with a buyer is still gonna have to have a buyer's brokerage agreement signed.
Okay. But why would
In order
incentivize?
to get that compensation, I'm sorry? What
Well,
was the next-
so what would incentivize a listing agent to work with a buyer knowing that the seller is not offering any compensation? And the reason why I say this is because when we enter listings into MLS, they automatically populate into Zillow that anybody can go into.
Right. Right, so that anybody can see, and it used to be that anybody could see what the buyer brokerage compensation was. So
I
why,
would do it for a lesser commission, for like a 1%, folks to do the buyer side, so.
to have both sides?
To have both sides.
So
I
Leslie,
got like $4 million listings, yeah.
That's not in the agreement,
that's what, Leslie?
but that's not offered by the seller. You already know that they're not going to compensate.
Right, but to Hazel's point, if the seller has said, I'm not compensating, but what in the examples that we've kind of been talking about, what sellers have been saying, or what we're, in the role playing thing, is that a seller says, look, I don't want to offer buyer brokerage compensation. Let's just see how it goes. Because part of the settlement is to try and create the negotiation from the brokerage to the buyer, the brokerage to the seller, and create any other negotiation between the buyer and the seller. So if a seller has offered 0, and now I've got the buyer, and I tell the buyer, well, the seller has offered 0, and the buyer says to me, oh, well, what can we do? Well, then it's my job to tell them what our options are. Well, they can pay nothing, and you'll pay the 2.5% that we've agreed to. You can ask, the buyer, can ask the seller to pay buyer brokerage compensation as part of your offer. So in an attempt to keep the buyer from leaving me to go to the listing agent because they think they can do an end around me and negotiate better with the listing agent because they've already got compensation on the listing side, would be for me to say to them, as part of your negotiation, you can ask the seller to pay buyer brokerage compensation. So that would be the hopes that would keep them from going to the listing agent. But now, say you do that, so now I write the offer for the buyer, we write in seller to pay buyer's brokerage 2.5%, and then we attach the compensation agreement, and now the seller, as part of the negotiation, says, well, I won't pay 2.5%, but I'll pay 1%. But the buyer brokerage agreement that we have is at 2.5%. So now the buyer has to determine whether they're willing to pay the additional 1.5%, or the brokerage has to determine whether or not we'll negotiate with the buyer to decrease our compensation to meet what the seller is paying. So it becomes a negotiation, a 3-way negotiation.
Well, am I allowed to say to the seller, they're wanting 2.5, and he says, I'll pay 1, but if the buyer will not accept that, can I say I will work both sides for the additional 1? Can I accept that?
You'll work with what?
I will work with the buyer for 1% if that's, would that
So
work?
you have the listing,
Mhm.
and the buyer's brokerage has said, we want 2.5%. And the seller said, I'm not paying 2.5%, but has not negotiated the compensation to the buyer's brokerage, right? Now you step in and say, if I can get the buyer to agree to 1%, will you be willing to pay? No, because you're violating the buyer brokerage agreement that exists between the buyer and the buyer's brokerage. So what you can do is facilitate the process by saying, they're asking for 2.5%, it's completely negotiable. If the other terms and conditions meet your needs, then I would say, in addition to negotiating the other terms and conditions, negotiate the compensation. And the seller can go back and say, I'll take all the terms and conditions that you stated, except buyer brokerage compensation, I will pay 1%. And if the buyer accepts that, and the buyer's brokerage compensation agreement was 2.5% with the buyer brokerage, then the buyer's gonna pay 1.5% to the buyer's broker.
And if they don't accept?
If they don't accept the 1%, if the buyers say, I'm not gonna take it unless you pay out 2.5, deal's dead.
Unless they fire the agent and then come back to me?
I mean, they could accept that in a case like that. Excuse me?
I still.
Well, you still, yeah, but she's saying, what if I terminate it, if the buyer then wants to terminate this? Well, termination's 2 ways, I mean, we can say we're not terminating. If we understand that that's kind of what they're trying to do, we can say we don't agree to the termination. Right? So,
Figure it out, if we don't get it.
I know. All right. Anybody online have anything else? You guys, it's gonna be kind of feeling things out, and I think we're probably thinking way too heavy about this. Our buyers understand how hard you work, So
And the sellers
in
don't
those,
wanna sell their property.
in those cases, the buyers are probably gonna sign the agreement without too much negotiation. I think that Leslie's point about first-time home buyers, buyers with VA, buyers with FHA are gonna have a challenge. But when we get to compensation, maybe we should just flip over that so that we can calm some of those fears. Let's move over to that. Let's just flip the page. I do wanna talk about that paragraph 6 for a second. Paragraph 6 talks about a retainer. Please note the,
Going away, isn't it?
yeah, thank you, Bonnie. The settlement does not allow for retainers. So we cannot charge retainers. That will not be a part of the revised buyer brokerage agreement. So paragraph 7 talks about compensation. So let's take a look at this. The broker's compensation is earned when, during the term of this agreement or any renewal or extension, the buyer or any person acting for or on behalf of the buyer contracts to acquire real property as specified in this agreement. The buyer will be responsible for paying the broker the amount specified below, plus any applicable taxes, but will be credited with any amount within which the broker receives from the seller or a real estate licensee who is working with a seller. So the right there, and that I don't believe that line is going to change, is that it states to the buyer, if the seller gives us anything, or the listing brokerage gives the buyer's brokerage anything, we're gonna credit that to you. So hopefully, Leslie, that'll help with some of the first-time home buyers, because we're still seeing sellers offer compensation on the buyer broker side. Purchase or exchange, so a flat fee amount or a percentage, or a dollar amount, or a percentage. Plus, and this would be where the brokerage fee sits in, so it would be an amount or percentage, select one only, or, so here's where we seem to have trouble. There's the dollar sign or a percentage, select only one, and then there's an or, a dollar or a percentage plus. If you're paying the brokerage transaction fee, you would use the first two blanks, because you would only be accepting the compensation through the negotiation with the seller for compensation. Excuse me, with the buyer for compensation, buyer brokerage. Buyer is committed to paying whatever's there, and you have elected to pay the brokerage fee. Or, so that or is important there. If you're going to go ahead and have the buyer pay the brokerage fee, you would choose those second blanks, dollar amount or percentage plus an amount. So there are a couple of ors in there. Please note it's one or the other. Don't fill it all in. Of the gross lease value, or to be paid when the buyer enters into a lease. I'm sorry. Oh shoot.
So you're talking the transaction fee is the
I went-
plus.
I went too far down. Sorry. There's no lines. So, excuse me?
You're talking about the transaction fee is the plus.
Yeah, on A, it's
Okay.
the plus,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, but
Yeah.
what if we want to cover ourselves in case of a bonus, like $1,000 bonus or something? So we need to add that into that place too, correct?
It would probably add that into the special clauses. Would be this for the compensation based on the pricing and the brokerage fee. For anything over that, so if we were to put in here, if they were seeing new construction, we want to make sure we were covered on a builder offered bonus, that would probably be under the special clauses, that last paragraph.
So could we put under special clauses something to the effect of any bonuses up to an amount of $5,000?
Yeah, so buyer brokerage bonus up to $5,000 to be paid, or bonuses offered to buyer brokerage up to $5,000 to be paid directly to buyer brokerage.
Okay,
Hey, Clark,
Yeah,
It's Karen Zambetti.
Hey.
I thought I learned at that last meeting, or class, that the 7C option was only referring to the lease purchase option. Is that correct?
Right, we're on A. We're working on A.
Up to C. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there are leases and there are options, option to purchase or option to lease, lease option purchase. So under compensation, A is where we say what the percentage is that the buyer is agreeing to pay us, or what the percentage the buyer is agreeing to pay us plus the brokerage fee.
Do we just put 0 or nothing if it's not, if we're not supposed to fill in?
So if I were filling this in under A, I would put nothing under the dollar amount, nothing, not a number, I would not touch it. Don't touch it, because when you put something in there, you put the numbers, right? So I would not touch it, and I would move straight over to the after the or, and I would put in nothing under the number, and I would put in 3% plus $250. If it were me right now. Today. That makes sense to everybody? B is for a lease. So if your buyer chooses to lease, so you can you do A and B? Yes, you can do A and B. It's not an or. If the buyer buys, this is what the compensation is. If the buyer leases, this is what the compensation is. And if the buyer executes an option, so an option to purchase, that would be C. So Karen, what's your comment on C?
It was my fault, because I thought we were on C and you were saying it's this or that, which it is. Nothing.
Okay, all right, I just wanna make sure we got it all out there. So lease is, usually 10%, or 10% plus the 250. So just make sure you're selecting the right one. The option is if, that we would be paid if they choose to option. So we would be paid on potentially the lease and or the purchase. And then D is anything other. The broker will be compensated for all other types of acquisitions, as if such acquisition were a purchase or exchange.
Clark,
Yes.
on option C, option broker, and those paid dollar amount or percent, would it just be 10% like the lease value up there, or no?
Yeah. Yes, it would be 10% on the lease. If the buyer enters into a lease with the option to purchase, the broker will be compensated for both the lease and the option.
So on C, where it says option broker will be paid a dollar amount or a percent, that's 10%, not 2.5 or not 3%.
No. Thank you for clarifying that. You would have 10% on the lease on B, and then 3% on the option, because the statement is that we will be paid both on the lease and the option.
Okay, so that for C, that percent area should be our 3%, not 10%.
Correct.
Thank you.
So lease would be 10% plus 250. Option would be 3%, because if the buyer enters into a lease with option to purchase, the broker will be compensated for both the lease and the option. If the buyer subsequently exercises the option, the amounts received by the broker for the lease and option will be credited towards the amount due broker for the purchase. So that goes back to whatever the seller was willing to credit, was willing to pay, we would credit the buyer for that amount. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We're gonna have lots of conversations. And then the buyer default, if the buyer will pay the broker's compensation immediately upon the buyer's default, or any contract to acquire property. On any contract to acquire property. Protection period, the buyer will pay the broker's compensation if within a certain number of days after the termination date, the buyer contracts to acquire any property which has been called to the buyer's attention by the broker or any other person, or found by the broker during the term of this agreement. The buyer's obligation to pay the broker's fee ceases upon the buyer entering into a good faith exclusive buyer brokerage agreement with another broker after termination.
Be sure I understand. So that would protect us, we had shown them something and then they decided to fire us and then they go buy that, they owe us.
Correct.
That's a good thing.
So that would be to prevent the end run to go to the listing agent.
Right.
To negotiate directly with them.
Correct.
If it's within a certain amount of days.
Whatever period of time. I'm guessing it would probably be, our current contracts call for a year. Listing agreements call for
So
a year.
can we put 365 in here?
You can, sure.
Thanks.
But I just want to ask a question, because it's unless they fire us and then turn around and sign a buyer brokerage with another agent, then then that number doesn't even matter.
If they sign, you're correct, if they sign another buyer brokerage agreement.
So it doesn't protect us on the property we had already shown them.
It protects on the property that you've already shown them as long as they don't execute another buyer agency agreement.
Okay, I missed that part, okay,
And go to another agent without
right,
this.
okay.
If they, but it's protection on for sale by owners, it protects you on any other type of property. If they go to another agent and that agent doesn't execute a buyer's agency agreement with them, because I think that's gonna happen a lot during the first 6 to 8 months, is we're just gonna, I'll get to it, and we don't, so if someone tries to run me around and go to the listing agent, well then they have to prove, in other words, we call MLS calls them, they have to show their buyer brokerage agreement, if not, we're entitled to compensation. So that's the protection period. Early termination, the buyer may terminate this agreement at any time by written notice to the broker, but will remain responsible for paying the broker's compensation if from the early termination date to the termination date, plus the protection period, if applicable, the buyer contracts to acquire any property which, prior to the early termination date, was found by the buyer or called to the buyer's attention by the broker or any other person. So see, that can protect us if they try and go around us, right? So they try and end our agreement early, right? Now they try and go around us to the listing agent. If they try and do that for a property we've shown them, we're still protected.
This is very detailed. I'm not sure someone can make a decision in a short meeting with them. You've got to have
I know.
to discuss it.
And I'm gonna disagree with you because I don't think it's any more detailed than what we give them now. And in most cases, they sign. I mean, I hate to say that, but
Hazel? Clark?
Well, I disagree because most people have had listing and buyer agreements for 20 years with me or more. And they're kind of familiar with that agreement or with the process, but they're not familiar with this buyer's agreement,
well,
So I think it's something they will have to absorb a little bit.
I don't disagree with you that they have to absorb it, but I also think we have to explain it. So if they're not willing to sign it then, we have to determine what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
Are you gonna continue to show them property or what are you gonna do? I'm sorry, go ahead, online.
I was just gonna, let just kind of give my personal experience. I mean, I haven't been in real estate as long as you, Hazel, but I will say that working with all different buyers that have been buyers before and new buyers, it has been received very well and appreciated actually that I've taken the time to sort of explain this side of compensation to them. And I actually had some buyers say, we're not going anywhere until we do sign this agreement with you. So that was really nice to get that kind of feedback. So far, I haven't had any pushback at all and has actually welcomed understanding this part of it. Even for people, like I said, that have bought higher end properties multiple times, they've actually wanted to know, what is this thing? What does this mean? And they're like, okay, well, we knew that sellers were, as sellers, that was part of compensation, but please, help us understand. So it's an opportunity for everybody to sort of, break the numbers down. And so far it's been a good feedback situation for me at least. So, and
Well,
those.
I agree, and I think the news out there, most of my buyers are very well educated,
Yeah.
and have already seen and know what's going on. So
Right.
they're asking,
But everybody say hi to my brother-in-law. Hi, Joe. Hi, Joe.
yeah.
Hi, Joe.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Joe.
All right, we'll talk to you later.
And you trust you.
Bonnie's saying, well, they trust you, and I think that's true. This is another one of those disruptors, I think, that Hazel's pointing out, that I think Jessica's pointing out, that that we're all kind of absorbing and trying to figure out how do I put this. That's why we're having these conversations, so you can start to try and figure out what's my wording, what do I want to say, how do I want to say it, because now we're looking at, rather than just running out and showing someone a house, we have to sit down with them at some point early on and say, this is what I'm doing for you. I mean, there are 105 items that NAR has come up with alone that we do that we probably didn't even realize that we do because we just do it from memory and from activity and all of that good stuff. So there are a lot of things that we do that we have to start to kind of either quantify, qualify, or at least bring them into the discussion so that they know they have the opportunity to negotiate not only with us, but with the seller. That's the other part of it, is while the negotiation has always occurred with the buyer and the seller, we've never been a part of the purchase and sale agreement. I think that the buyers and the sellers didn't always feel that. So now they're going to feel that engagement a little more, which is great, because with their engagement, with heavier engagement, comes a greater reliability on each of us in that process. So, okay. All right. Let's go back. Let me stop for a second and take a peek around. All right. So is the buyer committing to pay us? Yes. How much are they committing to pay us? Each brokerage will have their different standards. I assume that our standard will be something similar to the way that we've done listings. Is, here's the compensation, here's what we think is fair, here's a buffer that we'll participate with you in. If you go off of that buffer, then you know what the consequences are. So try to empower you with the decision-making process and ability to discuss that with your customer while you're in front of them and negotiate, not have to keep bouncing back and forth like a used car salesman, right? So where is the pay going to be identified? The pay will be identified in the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. Please, we kind of have gone over pieces of this that are important, but there are a couple of other things. There are our obligations, which is paragraph 4. But we're going to have to get better at talking about not only what our obligations are, but the value we bring to those obligations. There's something very different from I do this to the results of what I do and how that impacts you. So the value that I bring is how I manage those tasks that we pull together. When do they pay? They pay at closing. So if the seller is offering compensation, we saw that in the compensation paragraph, it says that anything that's being offered will be credited to what you owe. So it'll be important for us to share with the buyer, the seller on this one is offering 2%, the seller on this one is offering 1%, the seller on this one is offering no compensation, and that the buyer understands that in which case and then how their liability will be in that transaction, what the credit will be, potential credit is. Can that potential credit change during the negotiation? Absolutely, it can. Nothing is written into stone. So hopefully what's written into stone though is the compensation to you, the listing broker, and it broke the listing agent on the listing side, and then any discussion you've had with your seller on compensation to the buyer brokerage. Where are the forms? All of the forms are available in app files. As a matter of fact, all of the packages have been changed. They should have all of the updated forms in them. There are very few, there were only 7 NEFAR MLS forms that stayed, and those are in your files. So they're still there, like the seller's disclosure, the repair replacement agreement, the historic disclosure, the waiver of entry, the coming soon, and 2 others I can't remember right now off the top of my head. Anybody else remember? Shout out. How do you get these signed? So just like our current listing agreements, just like purchase and sale agreements, they can be signed in front of another person, so a wet signature, and they can also be signed through app files. So you can send any of these agreements through app files to have the person, your customer, sign these documents on the other side electronically is acceptable.
So we start a new form, a new in that file, so we're starting something new every time we show a property, so we can get the forms and get the agreement, or
No, once
so we just pull it up separately.
So when you go into app files, you would start a buyer file,
Right.
right? And then you would choose the package, and it's part of the package. So if you're working with a sale and purchase contract on a condo, post 1978, choose that package, bring all the forms over, and the buyer compensation will be a part of that. If you want to start a buyer agreement, if you want to start a buyer file and only pull in the buyer agency agreement, sure, of course you can do that. Yeah. It's just, you'll have all the other forms, and when you go back, you'll have duplicate forms, so you'll just have to delete the other forms.
Right.
When? So timing, we would like you to start getting comfortable with this now. Read through this, know that as of July 9th, there'll be a release of one, we'll make sure to get it out to you. Hopefully we'll get a red line version or something before the 9th, so I can send some feedback out to you. If not, the feedback will come within a day of us getting whatever the revised document looks like. When do you have to start using it? I'd recommend starting to use it before the end of July. When do you have to start using it? August 17th. If you're not using it August 17th, you're behind the 8 ball. So please start to use it before, get comfortable with it. Again, these Tuesday sessions are there for that. The agent forums are there to talk about these. And then we'll be having a buyer consult and seller consult roundtable, where anybody who's willing to bring in their buyer or seller consult and throw it to the middle of the table and start to create pieces or start to create a buyer or seller consult that we could maybe produce as a brokerage for you. And then you can customize a little bit. So something to help offset the work that you would have to do is an option for you there too. Working with sellers and the seller pays, I think it was Leslie who mentioned that. You're exactly right, Leslie, is there's still that opportunity in the listing consult and in the completion of the listing agreement for the seller to negotiate what the compensation is to the listing brokerage, but also an opportunity there to have the discussion of, are you interested in having a discussion with, or compensating the buyer's brokerage. Things that we've seen related to pricing, I mean, there's a ton of information in MLS, in the Domus Analytics that you can use to help a seller understand where pricing or how pricing is going to impact traffic. There are a lot of statistics in showing time that can help us. Please remember, if you have a listing starting August 17th, you are probably going to have to amend that listing agreement. It will still be a valid listing agreement, but we're probably going to have to amend it. Any buyer brokerage agreement that has been executed between now and August 16th, August 16th, will probably have to be amended because of course the retainer is coming out. So if you had an agreement and put a retainer in, we'd have to negate that retainer. Or if the compensation has changed, the buyer has negotiated compensation, because all of these agreements can be renegotiated at any time or amended at any time. But if the seller is willing to pay compensation to the buyer brokerage, how is that communicated? That's going to have to be communicated through a compensation agreement and or an email with the other side. What's the buyer's broker responsibility, the buyer's agent responsibility, is to make those phone calls to ensure they understand what the compensation is. Can the compensation be different for one brokerage versus a different brokerage? It should not be. Whatever compensation the seller has agreed to, that is what should be disclosed to all parties calling. So if the seller then attempts to or would like to negotiate the buyer brokerage compensation, they can do that during the negotiation of the offer. Can a price be increased to offset the cost of the compensation to the buyer's brokerage? That's up to the seller and the buyer. And of course, that can be impacted by the appraisal. So how does it, if you then agree to increase the price, like we've done in cases sometimes where the buyer is asking for assistance with closing costs, and they've increased the price, if the property doesn't appraise, then all terms are gonna have to be renegotiated. So
I was gonna say, we're
adding the new order.
if the appraisal can copy it. It's just changes.
Right, but if you up it and the appraisal doesn't cover it, then your all terms and conditions are open for renegotiation.
So you said something about, so as of August 17th, if the listing agreement before that includes compensation for the buyer's agent, then it has to be amended as of August 17th.
There will most likely be an amendment that comes out that we will have to attach to our current listing agreements. I imagine it will confirm that the seller understands that there is, in the compensation they've agreed to pay, there is buyer brokerage compensation and listing brokerage compensation. I would imagine that would be one of the clarifications. There could be others, but I can pretty much guarantee that there's going to be an amendment that will have to have completed by any current seller to amend the current listing.
So you will set up for us to have listings out there, or we just?
Yeah, it'll be I won't create the form will come from Florida Realtors, but yes, you'll be made aware, and then we'll be requesting that form from you for each
You
of
put the
this.
verbs together that you want us to do, or we just do our own?
Well, no, the verbiage will come from Florida Realtors, and it'll be in a standard form, an amendment form. It won't be anything that we write. That's a good point, though, because we are adding some additional office forms that we feel are important to help you through the listing as it relates to things like personal property and then other clauses that are now no longer in the listing agreement or in the purchase and sale agreement that we may want to at least make people aware of.
Well, all the companies in Jackson will be using the same forms now.
Yes.
This clearly states that we're working as transaction brokers. Is this going to apply to Berkshire Hathaway too?
This form is available as a single agent form also. So no, in most cases, Century, ERA, Roundtable, Berkshire Hathaway, one of the Century 21 offices will continue to act as single agents, and they'll use the single agent buyer brokerage agreement, they'll use the single agent listing agreement, and they'll use the single agent purchase. Oh no, there's no single agent purchase. So they'll remain single agents. So, and that's another thing, I think that's a really good point, is that you need to be aware, while consumers don't care whether we act as single agents or transaction brokers, you should, and you should also care to know what the other party is. And in most cases, those brokerages we just named are acting as single agents and do not disclose and have no obligation to disclose according to Florida statutes. They do have an obligation according to the Code of Ethics, and they choose to ignore that in most cases.
Will it still be on our MLS form?
I'm sorry?
Will it still be on our MLS form?
Whether they're acting as a single agent or not?
Yeah,
You mean whether the listing agreement is single agent or not?
right.
That may be removed.
Oh, okay.
So we won't be co-oping, so we won't be checking those boxes.
Right, exactly. So there would be no
Well,
reason.
co-op will be off, but the type of listing agreement should still be disclosed, although there's conversation going back and forth of removing that field also. Because they don't update it now.
Right.
So it's deceitful, the data is incorrect as it is. Because they say they took it as a listing, a single agent listing, when they really didn't. Because they gave them the transaction brokers at the same time. So yet they advertise it as a single agency listing, and then they sell it themselves, and it's still shown as a single agency listing when it truly could not. So it's bad data. Anyway.
You're not supposed to catch that though, you know?
Yeah.
Well,
I think that we all have a concern over all of our buyers and their openness to paying the buyer brokerage compensation or paying the buyer broker. I think that it definitely will be an issue because the buyer that's a first time home buyer, we now have to counsel them on closing costs, down payment, and what part of the closing cost is buyer brokerage compensation. So we're gonna have to be aware of that and that commitment. Fortunately, what will not be removed from the buyer brokerage agreement is anything paid by the seller will be credited to the buyer. So that's one thing. The other thing that we can do is help empower them by letting them know that they still have every right, no matter what we've agreed to to negotiate with the seller themselves through you, through their purchase and sale agreement. Please note, anytime you write anything into the purchase and sale agreement, things like seller to pay buyer's broker should not be written. It should be buyer requests seller to pay buyer's brokerage X% or X amount of money, or Y amount of money, whatever it happens to be. So buyer requests, everything that is going to within the purchase and sale agreement should be buyer requesting of the seller. Buyer requests seller to pay X number of dollars towards closing costs and 2% towards buyer's brokerage. Should be able to. What are the terms? We're still discussing what we believe should be a standard for terms, the term or length of the agreement. What else?
Yes,
Park-
so
Okay, we've got two people who spoke at the same time. I'm not sure who wants to jump on first.
Bonnie was first.
Okay, just stupid question because I wasn't paying attention. On line 2, the broker, we put our name and then the legends of real estate, or how is that supposed to go?
The way it's outlined here, it should be the real estate broker, so Legends of Real Estate in the office, San Jose Beaches. I would say that will probably come out. I would put the Legends of Real Estate hyphen Bonnie Seeker.
Okay, okay.
Hyphen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So to piggyback off of her, after the Legends of Real Estate where there's like a slash and it says office, can we also put the office and then our name, whoever the agent is?
Sure, until we get the revised version, I think it's fine to say the Legends of Real Estate / San Jose, Jessica Adams, or
Perfect.
Jessica Adams.
Thank you. So my question was something different than that. On the last page of line item 13, special clauses, going back to the question that we had about bonuses from builders, should we say?
It can come from anybody.
Okay, so but it should state buyer request any bonuses offered to.
Well, you're talking about the buyer agency agreement. So in the buyer agency agreement, you would say something to the effect of buyer agrees that any bonuses offered to buyer brokerage can be paid straight through to buyer brokerage, something like that. Where the buyer is agreeing within their agreement with us. Buyer is acknowledging that any additional compensation can pass through to the buyer's brokerage. I will say that at Florida Realtors and NAR, in discussions about bonuses and compensation greater than what was accepted. Another thing that will be in the new agreement is that the brokerage is unable to accept any more than what the buyer and the buyer brokerage have agreed to. So if the buyer and the buyer's brokerage have agreed to 2.5%, and the seller is offering 3%, the buyer's brokerage can only accept 2.5%. Right? Could the buyer brokerage agreement be amended to 3%? Yes. And then of course you have to go back to the buyer and have that discussion. Well, they're offering 3%. I'd like to amend this to accept that 3% on behalf of the buyer brokers. And the buyer could say, well, no, why can't I get that other 0.5%? Or let's agree to split that other 0.5%. And bonuses could be the same way. So in the special clauses, if you're adding a clause related to bonuses, it would say that the buyer acknowledges bonuses up to a certain amount will be paid.
If it's not a full price.
Will be paid to the broker. And everything is negotiable. So you could get into a situation where you say, look, they're willing to pay this $3,000 bonus. What if we split it? Will that help offset some of your costs? And are you good with that? And then you could amend the buyer brokerage agreement to state that.
So my question would be, could you have in the buyer brokerage agreement the 3% commission to the buyer brokerage from the buyer, the 3% commission from the sale but then have a sentence in there that says the buyer brokerage allows a concession of 0.5% for that particular buyer.
I'm not sure I understand. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to, so if at the onset of the buyer brokerage agreement, the terms are 3%, then no, I would not add a statement into the additional terms that says we could adjust it by 0.5%. I would wait to determine what the seller offers and is credited, and if we have to make an adjustment at that time, adjust the buyer brokerage agreement.
So if we go into an agreement for 2.5% with our buyer, then we can't make the adjustment, or we still can.
What adjustment, up or down?
If the seller was offering 3% and we've already gone into an agreement for 2.5%.
So if you've already gone into an agreement for 2.5, the new agreement will state that you can only accept 2.5.
Right.
So if a seller is offering 3, you would have to amend the agreement to go up to 3%.
So we can amend down, but not up.
You can amend any way you want. I mean, sorry, you can amend the compensation that the buyer has to pay up or down.
Okay. So that's helpful. So if we wanted to go under an agreement for 2.5, or let's just say somebody that we were also selling their house on, that's the agreement that we've agreed to, but then the seller, the buyer finds a house and the seller is offering compensation of 2.75 or 3%, we could amend this buyer brokerage agreement to reflect the new percentage that the seller's offering the brokerage compensation on that particular property.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you can. You gotta, first of all, we'll set some standards for our brokerage. Second of all, if I like anything about all of this, it's helping us to focus on value. And I would request that we not go into an agreement with the option of reducing.
No.
If we know what power we have, so for example, if we've gone into an agreement with a buyer at 3%, and the seller is offering 2.5, the buyer knows that 2.5% will be credited to them. What happens with that extra 0.5%? Well, the way that the agreement is structured, the buyer would be responsible for the additional 0.5%. Done. Now, if you're negotiating or if you're getting into a thicket and there has to be an adjustment, then of course our guidelines will say how far we would participate, what we would do, how we would help you, or if it has to go outside of what you think is part of our policy, then that's something we have to talk about. But I would prefer that we didn't go in saying, oh, don't worry, it's 3%, but if it's less, we'll waive it. Or, oh, if it's less, we'll adjust it. Or don't worry, we'll figure, we'll take the hit on it. If you're going in, if you're saying, okay, Mr. and Ms. Buyer, you just listed with me and you're paying me, over here, and now I'm asking you to pay over here, and I want to cut it. Well, if you adjust it based on what you've decided, that's one thing. When your agreement is negotiated with you, you'll know what to refer to back into the company policies as to if there would be any liability to you as the agent. But I'm concerned that we're leading towards cutting compensation or establishing compensation and saying to the buyer, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean anything. It has to mean something. It has to have teeth and mean something for the buyer to have, for the buyer to understand what their liability and skin is in the game, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, then.
No, you're not. No, that helped me. That's good. That's good. Because I think if you're working with a customer and you're helping them sell their home and you're helping them find a property and you've talked about compensation on both sides for both sides, and you're trying to establish value, but also know that this may be somebody that you know personally. So where do you put this in here the right way to maintain your value, but also to provide something back to them because you're working on both sides of the deal? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, you're trying to.
Yeah.
You're trying to reward.
Yes.
Loyalty and, consistent business and potential.
Right.
referral.
And and especially with the price range. I mean, because we talk about the brokerage guidelines, and as long as we're within that brokerage guidelines, then we're good. And I think that's sort of what I was getting at as well. The dollar amount.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, right now, the way that I'm looking at it is it's going to be developed similar to how we've done listings, but that the percentages are broken out buyer versus seller.
Perfect. Thanks.
Anybody else online?
Just one question about whenever there is any kind of amendment on this buyer brokerage agreement or exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, there is not an amendment form, but an email is good enough to amend it?
Currently, yes. I imagine just like there was the modification form to the compensation agreement, there will probably be a modification form that's released for the buyer brokerage agreement. If not, then an amendment form or email would be sufficient.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what they're gonna come with, but I won't. I mean, I'll let you guys know as soon as I do.
Okay. Okay,
Anyone else?
very good.
Okay.
Clark.
You all?
Hey, Clark, it's Rhonda. I have a quick comment for you. You know, I read too much and I listen to too many podcasts, but I heard a real doozy the other day and I wanted to run it by you. One guy said he was putting it on, he was going to get a burner phone and put on all his listings to contact him at that phone number. And his voicemail is going to say, "Hi, you've reached Rhonda with the Legends of Real Estate. I am offering 2.5% buyer's agent commission on the following property." Boom, the end. Because they don't want to answer their phones.
That's right.
That's true. And is that possible? Is it doable and does it abide by the agreement? Yeah, it does, because compensation can be advertised on a flyer. We're not recommend that because as sure as compensation is X on one property and Y on another, yeah, I don't. So we're not recommending that you put out agreement. There goes Hazel.
Hi, Hazel.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, so we're not recommending that. We would recommend currently that if you have, when you have the property right now, it's showing MLS after August 17th, any flyers state seller offering buyer brokerage compensation. Please don't say at the level, because we don't know what the level will be. We know what level the seller has agreed to, but negotiation through the offer could reduce that, could increase that. So we're not recommending putting a number on flyers, but remember that's part of this whole thing, is that the buyer and seller are supposed to be negotiating with each other, and the transparency of it between the parties. So us putting a number out there kind of negates some of that. That's part of the reason that Real MLS is elected not to put a listing concessions amount in there. Are there concessions that will be reflected after closing like they do now? Yes, but not a listing concessions offer.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that example too. That's real estate agents learning to be creative. Oh, and I'm sorry, just to kind of bring that full circle, please note there is a checker for MLS. Anytime there's words like commission, compensation, anything, public remarks, private remarks, anything, pictures of the kitchen with a plate with 3 cookies on it. those will be tagged. If the words compensation or commission or any of that are used in public or private remarks, it's an immediate $1,000 fine. That cannot be taken away. That's an immediate $1,000 fine. It's not like, hey, by the way, I think you made a mistake, and can you correct it in the next 24 hours? It's like, hey, this is wrong, here's your $1,000 fine. So,
Who's imposing that?
MLS,
Local.
real MLS. Because you're putting everything into MLS. They'll be doing spot checks on buyer agreements, they'll be doing spot checks on waivers and everything, so.
No
Okay.
fruit in the basket and no cookies on the plate.
Exactly, nothing in the basket, no cookies on the plate. So, and NAR, just so you know, NAR will have checkers out.
Yeah.
So that will increase. As part of the agreement, they're going to have to do some checks and balances. So there'll be people calling, there'll be people asking.
Clark, one more little tidbit I got, speaking of all of that. It's not just NAR that we have to worry about. There are attorneys in Tallahassee, from what I hear, getting people to be secret shoppers,
Yeah,
buyers, fake sellers, and they're going to try to get a new class action lawsuit going.
yeah. That doesn't surprise me. Thank you for letting us know.
Cool.
Yeah. So we're gonna, I mean, the first 6 months are gonna be tough, but we've survived other things. So. And, you know, maybe there's a partner that you wanna get and say, hey, look over my listing agreement. Hey, look over my purchase and sale agreement. I'll look it over, you know. I mean, I'll look it over after it's executed. If you want me to look it over before it's executed, I'm happy to do that. Whatever it is, I'm happy to do it. So, all right, we good?
Thank you.
Clark,
Yes, ma'am.
can you explain that again about the cookies on the plate and
Yeah,
no fruit on the bowl? I don't understand.
The example was given of an agent putting a plate on the table with 3 cookies on it and taking a picture and using that picture to communicate that the compensation is 3%.
Oh, get out of town.
Also on portraits, painted portraits have a kind of a hidden number 3 that you can see if you look really close.
Watch how many bananas you hang.
Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll continue to work with buyers and sellers and not have to spend our time trying to figure out how to creatively, maybe we'll answer our phone and then we can have communication talk.
And then get called by a shopper, find out if we're answering all the questions. That's why we don't answer.
Well, not
the
only
phone.
asking the questions, but the shoppers will be there to see if you're willing to go out and show a property before having anything signed, whether it's a showing agreement or a buyer agency agreement.
So when we call to ask how much a seller is willing to contribute,
Right?
and then they tell us a number, and then we say, can you send us your agreement? They can ask us, well, send me your buyer broker agreement.
Can they ask you for that? They can ask you for that, you don't have to provide it, that's not gonna provide them anything that they, I mean, what, I'm sorry, why would they be asking for that?
I don't know, I guess that's what I was trying to understand from what you said. It just kind of was confusing to me. So I just.
So when you call them, if you wanna memorialize what they say, it can be in an email, but that's what the compensation agreement is for. You can send, they should be able to send that, that's why I put it in both the listing packet and the sales packet. Is so that when you're with the seller, if the seller is agreeing to pay us 5.5%, and the compensation that he's willing to offer to the buyer's brokerage is 2.5%, then that should be memorialized on that seller's broker to buyer's broker agreement.
Right,
Don't-
no, I understand that.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking, I was still stuck on the part of the there's gonna be people out there shopping, you know, and trying to verify that you have a buyer broker agreement.
I'm sorry, they're gonna be shopping to ensure that you will execute a buyer broker agreement before showing them. They will
Okay, got it.
shop to see how you handle showing them a property.
Okay, that clears it up.
Yeah, will you run out and show them a property and then talk about the buyer agency agreement? Or will you, over the phone, say, great, I would love to show you property, let's meet at the office, I'd like to discuss with you our buyer brokerage agreement, or there are some things that I'd like to do, or not do, but I have a buyer consult that I would like to review with you prior to showing property. So any stopgap that you give to running out and showing the property without having something executed.
Clear, thank you.
Okay, good question though.
That's one of the reasons that open houses are becoming popular again, is because we can, at least people can come see the property.
So Kathy was saying open houses are getting popular because you don't have as much liability. And then, you know, as people come through, you can talk to them and ask them if they're working with an agent. If they're not, you can begin the process of trying to create a bond, but you're not showing them that house.
Thank you, Clark.
Thank you, Clark.
Thank you, guys. We okay? Have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you for sticking it out. If you have things that we missed or questions or concerns, email me. Or I've set up one-on-ones with a lot of agents via Zoom. We can do that too. We can do a 30-minute call, a 20-minute call, an hour call. If there's clarification or you want to go back and forth. So that's available. Please don't, please take advantage of it. Yeah, yeah. And Bonnie just offered margaritas. I am totally open to that too.
Clark, do we?
Thanks, guys. Let me
Go
stop
ahead,
this.
Kathy.
I'm gonna stop the recording. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Do we have a simple form that explains the nuts and bolts of this law?